The dust-choked air of Yankton, South Dakota swirled through the batwing doors of the Red Garter Saloon as Violet Zimmerman wiped the same spot on the bar counter for what felt like the 1,000th time that day. Her muscles ached from the 14-hour shift that had begun at dawn, but her face remained carefully composed, showing weakness in Victor Blackwell's establishment was never wise. "Pour faster, girl," Victor shouted from across the saloon where he was counting the night's earnings, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "These men work hard for their money, and I work hard to take it from them." The patrons laughed, a harsh sound that made Violet flinch despite her best efforts. 3 years she'd been here, trapped by a debt that somehow grew larger no matter how many hours she worked. 22 years old, and nothing to show for it but calloused hands and a collection of bruises she kept hidden beneath her long sleeves. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, quickening her pace as she poured whiskey for a table of ranch hands. The night crawled on, each minute stretching longer than the last. The piano player hammered out tinny melodies while card games grew rowdier with each passing hour. Victor watched it all with the calculating eyes of a man who considered himself king of his small domain. As midnight approached, the batwing doors swung open once more, but this time the usual chatter died down momentarily. The newcomer stood tall, at least 6'3", with broad shoulders, and the weather-beaten look of a man who lived his life under the open sky. Dust covered his clothes from the trail, but there was something in his stance that suggested he wasn't just another drifter passing through. His eyes, sharp and blue as a mountain lake, scanned the room with deliberate care before settling on the bar. "Water, please," he said as he approached, his voice low but clear. Violet nodded, reaching for a clean glass. "That'll be 2 cents. He placed a nickel on the counter. "Keep the change." "Mighty generous," she murmured, sliding the water toward him. "Not generosity, just fairness," he replied, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Zane Alderman," he offered. "Just rode in from Wyoming Territory." "Violet," she answered simply, avoiding her last name as she always did. Victor insisted she use his surname when introducing herself to customers, a constant reminder of his claim on her. Zane's gaze lingered on her face a moment too long, noticing what others often missed: the carefully concealed tiredness in her eyes, the wariness in her movements. "How long have you been working here, Violet?" he asked, sipping his water. Before she could answer, Victor's booming voice interrupted. "She's been here long enough to know not to waste time chatting when there's work to be done." He appeared behind Violet like a shadow, his hand gripping her shoulder tight enough to make her wince. "Isn't that right, Miss Zimmerman?" "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," she replied automatically. Zane straightened slightly, his expression unchanging save for a hardness that entered his eyes. "I believe the lady and I were having a conversation." Victor chuckled, the sound lacking any warmth. "The lady? This is no lady, stranger. This is my property until she works off what she owes me." He leaned closer to Zane, lowering his voice. "Her father gambled away everything he had at my tables, including her services. She's mine until I say otherwise." Violet's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept her eyes downcast. It was the story of her life, told and retold to every man who showed the slightest interest in her. A cautionary tale about the price of another man's weakness. "Last I checked," Zane said coolly, "slavery was abolished in these United States." "This ain't slavery," Victor countered with a smirk. "It's a business arrangement, one that's perfectly legal in Dakota Territory. Ask anyone in town." He gestured broadly around the saloon. "Ain't that right, boys?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Yankton might be growing into a respectable town since becoming the territorial capital, but Victor Blackwell's influence ran deep, greased by money and maintained through fear. Zane's gaze returned to Violet. "How much does she owe?" Victor laughed outright. "More than a saddle tramp like you could ever pay, Cowboy." He squeezed Violet's shoulder again. "Besides, she's not for sale. Too valuable, brings in the customers with that pretty face." His fingers traced a line down her cheek, making her skin crawl. Violet felt something inside her shrink back, as it always did when Victor touched her. But for the first time in years, she also felt something else, a tiny spark of defiance, kindled by the steady gaze of the stranger standing before her. "Now, if you're not buying anything stronger than water," Victor continued, "perhaps you should find somewhere else to spend your evening." Zane didn't move. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I think I'll stay a while. How about a game of poker, Mr. Blackwell? I hear you're quite the card player." A gleam of interest flashed in Victor's eyes. "You looking to lose your money that badly?" "On the contrary," Zane replied, loosening the pouch strings to reveal a glint of gold. "I'm looking to win." Within minutes, a table had been cleared and Zane sat across from Victor, cards in hand. The usual evening crowd gathered around, eager to see the newcomer take on the man who'd fleeced half the territory with his card skills. Violet moved between tables, serving drinks and keeping her head down, but her attention remained fixed on the game. Hand after hand, Zane held his own, neither winning nor losing significantly. Victor's initial amusement gradually gave way to focused concentration, then to thinly veiled irritation. "You play a careful game, Mr. Alderman," Victor observed after nearly an hour, his tone friendly even as his eyes hardened. "I learned early that patience often pays better than recklessness," Zane replied, matching Victor's bet without hesitation. The night wore on, the crowd thinning as most patrons returned to their homes or rooms. Only the most dedicated gamblers and drinkers remained, along with Victor's two enforcers who lurked in the corners of the room, watching the newcomer with obvious suspicion. Near 2 in the morning, Victor called for a final hand, double or nothing. The pot had grown substantial, with both men having won and lost throughout the evening. Violet paused in her cleaning, holding her breath as the cards were dealt. She watched Victor's eyes flicker with triumph as he examined his hand, a tell she'd learned to recognize over the years. He was confident, perhaps too confident. Zane's expression remained impassive as he studied his own cards. "I'll raise you," Zane said calmly, pushing forward an amount that made even Victor hesitate. "That's more than you've shown tonight," Victor observed cautiously. Zane nodded toward his saddlebags by his feet. "I've got more where that came from. Question is, are you willing to match it?" Victor's eyes narrowed. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Everything I have against everything you have on that table," Zane replied. Then, with deliberate care, he added, "plus Violet's contract." The room fell silent. Violet nearly dropped the glass she was holding. "Excuse me." Victor's voice was dangerously soft. "You heard me," Zane continued evenly. "You're so confident she'll never be free, prove it. If you're as good at cards as everyone says, it shouldn't be a risk at all." Victor stared at him for a long moment before letting out a bark of laughter. "You must be either desperate or a fool. What's your interest in the girl anyway?" "Let's just say I don't believe in debt servitude," Zane replied, "especially when the terms seem to be ever-changing to keep someone in bondage." The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Victor's jaw tightened visibly. "Fine," he snapped, eyes glittering with malice. "You want to lose everything you own over some misplaced sense of chivalry. Be my guest." He turned toward Violet. "Bring me the ledger from my office." Violet hurried to comply, her heart hammering in her chest. The leather-bound book, contained the record of her debt, the ever-increasing sum that kept her chained to this place. She'd seen it only a handful of times, had watched in dismay as Victor added charges for room and board, for broken glasses, for anything he could think of to keep her balance growing rather than shrinking. When she returned, Victor snatched the book from her hands and slammed it onto the table beside the pot. There. Everything in writing, all legal and proper. If by some miracle you win, she walks free with you tonight. If I win, and I get everything you own, including that fine horse I saw you ride in on. Zane nodded once. Deal. The final cards were dealt. Violet stood frozen, barely breathing as the two men studied their hands. Around them, the few remaining patrons leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something momentous. Victor's smile grew as he laid down his cards one by one. Full house, kings over queens. He reached for the pot. Better luck next time, Cowb. Not so fast, Zane interrupted, placing his own cards on the table with methodical precision. 4 of a kind, aces. The silence that followed was absolute. Victor stared at the cards, his face draining of color before flushing dark red. You cheated, he growled, half rising from his chair. I did not, Zane replied calmly, and you know it. We've had an audience all night, including your own men. Every hand was dealt fair. Victor's eyes darted around the room, seeking support, but found none. Even his loyal enforcers appeared uncertain, having witnessed the entire game. The contract, Zane said, extending his hand. And the ledger. For a moment, Violet thought Victor might explode with rage, his hands clenched into fists, knuckles white with strain. But then, slowly, deliberately, he pushed the ledger across the table. Take it, he spat. Take her. She's been more trouble than she's worth anyway. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. But remember this, Cowboy, Yankton is my town. Cross my path again, and cards won't settle our differences. Zane collected his winnings without comment, tucking the ledger into his coat. Only then did he look at Violet, who stood paralyzed with disbelief. You have belongings to collect, he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to form words. Go get them, he instructed. I'll wait right here. Violet hurried to the small room off the kitchen where she'd lived for the past 3 years. Her possessions were meager: a spare dress, a shawl, a hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring and a faded photograph of her parents. Everything fit into a worn carpet bag that had once belonged to her father. When she returned, Zane stood waiting by the door, his saddlebag slung over one shoulder. Victor had disappeared, likely to nurse his wounded pride with a bottle in his private quarters. Ready? Zane asked. Violet hesitated, suddenly afraid. She'd dreamed of freedom for so long, but now that it was here, uncertainty gripped her. Who was this man? What did he want from her? Had she merely traded one form of servitude for another? As if reading her thoughts, Zane spoke again, his voice gentler than before. You're free, Miss Zimmerman. The debt is settled. What happens next is entirely your choice. Why? She finally managed to ask. Why would you do this for a stranger? A shadow passed over his features. Let's just say I've seen what men like Blackwell do to people who can't fight back. I've seen enough of it for one lifetime. He held the door open for her, and after a moment's hesitation, Violet stepped through it. The night air hit her like a promise, cool, clean, and full of possibilities she'd long since stopped imagining. Dawn was just breaking over the eastern horizon when they reached the livery stable where Zane had left his horse. The massive chestnut stallion nickered softly as they approached. This is Rusty, Zane said, patting the animal's neck. He's been my only consistent companion for the past few years. Violet approached cautiously, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. He's beautiful. He's also stubborn, opinionated, and too smart for his own good, Zane replied with a hint of a smile, but I wouldn't trade him for anything. He secured her carpet bag to the saddle and then turned to her. I've got a room at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Peterson's place. I can escort you there, help you get settled. She's a good woman who won't ask too many questions. Violet blinked in surprise. You're not. I thought. Understanding dawned in Zane's eyes. You thought I was claiming you for myself. It wasn't a question. She looked away, embarrassed. Why else would a man pay so much to free a saloon girl? Because it was the right thing to do, he said simply. And because no one should be held captive for another person's mistakes. He paused, then added, I meant what I said, Violet. You're free. That includes being free from any obligation to me. The weight of his words settled around her, almost too much to comprehend after years of being told her worth lay only in what she could provide to others. Freedom was a foreign concept, frightening in its vastness. I don't know what to do, she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. I have nowhere to go, no family left. Victor made sure I had no friends in town. Zane considered this. What did you do before the saloon? My father was a school teacher, she replied. Before the drink took him, I helped him sometimes with the younger children. A faint smile touched her lips at the memory. I loved it. The books, the learning, watching them understand something for the first time. He nodded thoughtfully. Yankton's growing. They're always in need of teachers or assistants. Then he paused, seeming to make a decision. I've got business that keeps me here for a few weeks. I need to finalize some cattle contracts with the Indian agency. Perhaps by then, you'll have a clearer idea of what you want to do next. Relief washed through her. A few weeks. Time to think, to plan, to adjust to this new reality. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Live your life, he answered. That's repayment enough. He held out his hand to help her mount the horse. Now, let's get you to Mrs. Peterson's before Victor sobers up enough to change his mind. As the sun rose higher over Yankton, Violet rode behind Zane, her arms wrapped cautiously around his waist, each hoofbeat taking her further from her past, and towards something she'd stopped believing in long ago, a future of her own making. Mrs. Peterson turned out to be exactly as Zane had described, a kindly widow in her 60s, who asked few questions beyond what Violet would like for breakfast. The boarding house was modest but clean, with polished wooden floors and crisp white curtains that billowed in the morning breeze. Room at the end of the hall, Mrs. Peterson said, handing Violet a key. Baths down the back stairs. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. I don't abide drinking or men in the rooms. She gave Zane a pointed look. Understood, madam, he replied with a respectful nod. I'm staying at the hotel across town. Just wanted to make sure Miss Zimmerman found safe accommodation. The older woman's expression softened slightly. Well, she's found it. I run a respectable establishment. After ensuring Violet was settled, Zane prepared to take his leave. I have meetings most of today, but perhaps we could meet for supper tomorrow. The cafe on Main Street serves a decent meal. I'd like that, Violet replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Left alone in her new room, the first private space she'd had in years that wasn't attached to a saloon, Violet sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself to cry. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of relief and overwhelming gratitude. 3 years of serving drinks, dodging wandering hands, sleeping with one eye open, and it had ended in a single night because a stranger had decided she deserved better. It seemed impossible, and yet here she was. The following day, after the best night's sleep she'd had in memory, Violet ventured into town. Yankton had changed considerably since she'd last been able to walk freely through its streets. New buildings had sprung up, businesses had opened, and the territorial government had brought an air of respectability to what had once been a rough river town. She found herself drawn to a small shop with a sign reading Thompson's Books and Stationery. Inside, the scent of paper and binding glue brought back memories of her father's small collection of books, treasures he'd managed to hold onto even as he lost everything else. "Can I help you, miss?" asked an elderly man behind the counter. "I'm just looking," Violet replied, running her fingers along the spines of several volumes. "Take your time," he said kindly. "Always nice to meet another book lover." She spent almost an hour there, eventually purchasing a modest volume of poetry with some of the coins Zane had insisted she take to tide her over. When the shopkeeper, Mr. Thompson himself, mentioned he needed part-time help organizing his inventory, Violet found herself volunteering before she'd even thought it through. "I'm good with books," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "And I can write a fair hand." Mr. Thompson studied her thoughtfully. "Can you start tomorrow? 4 hours in the afternoon, 3 days a week." By the time she met Zane for supper, Violet had secured not only the position at the bookshop, but also a potential opportunity to assist at the schoolhouse once the new term began in the fall. "You've been busy," Zane remarked as she shared her news over plates of roast beef and potatoes. "I can hardly believe it myself," she admitted. "Yesterday morning I belonged to Victor Blackwell, and today I'm planning a future." She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "It doesn't seem real." "It's real," Zane assured her, "and well-deserved." Over the meal, Violet learned more about the man who changed her life. Zane Alderman had grown up on a small ranch in Missouri, the son of a farmer who'd fought for the Union in the war. After his parents died of fever, he'd headed west, working as a cowhand before saving enough to buy his own small herd. Now he worked as a cattle broker, negotiating deals between ranchers and buyers, including the Indian agencies that supplied the reservations. "It's not always honest work," he admitted, his expression darkening. "Too many agents skimming profits, delivering less than what was promised. I try to ensure the tribes get what they're owed, but it's an uphill battle." "You care about doing what's right," Violet observed. "Even when it costs you." He glanced up at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I try, not always successfully. Successfully enough to risk everything for a saloon girl you'd never met before," she pointed out. A faint smile touched his lips. "Perhaps I have a weakness for lost causes." "Is that what I am, a lost cause?" There was no bitterness in her question, only curiosity. "No," he replied immediately. "You're the opposite, a found cause, if anything." The days that followed fell into a pattern. Violet worked at the bookshop 3 afternoons a week, using her mornings to help Mrs. Peterson with household tasks in exchange for reduced rent. In the evenings, she often met Zane for supper, their conversations growing longer and more comfortable as they learned each other's stories. She told him about her childhood in Illinois, her father's descent into gambling and drinking after her mother's death, their westward journey that was meant to be a fresh start, but instead led to even deeper debt. He shared tales of the open range, the characters he'd met on cattle drives, the beauty and harshness of the territories few Easterners ever saw. A week passed, then 2. Violet began to feel at home in her new life, gaining confidence with each day of freedom. The few times she glimpsed Victor Blackwell on the street, he pointedly ignored her, though the hatred in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking sent chills down her spine. "He won't bother you," Zane assured her when she mentioned her concerns. "He might be cruel, but he's not stupid." The territorial marshal knows about our card game, and Victor won't risk his business by causing trouble. Despite his reassurances, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that Victor wasn't finished with her or with Zane. The man had built his reputation on never losing, never being bested. She doubted he would simply accept his defeat and move on. Her fears proved justified on a warm evening in late June. She had just closed up the bookshop and was walking back to the boarding house when a rough hand seized her arm, dragging her into the narrow alley between buildings. "Hello, Violet," Victor's voice slurred in her ear, the stench of whiskey on his breath. "Enjoying your freedom?" "Let go of me," she demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Or what?" he sneered, his grip tightening. "You'll run to your cowboy protector, not this time." He shoved her against the brick wall, his massive frame blocking any escape. "You humiliated me, both of you, and nobody does that to Victor Blackwell without consequences." Panic rose in her throat, but with it came a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. 3 weeks of freedom had changed something fundamental inside her. She was no longer the cowed girl who'd accepted mistreatment as her lot in life. "You humiliated yourself," she retorted, "by treating people like property, by cheating them out of what's rightfully theirs." His face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little," his hand raised to strike her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Zane's voice, cold and hard as steel, came from the entrance to the alley. He stood silhouetted against the evening light, one hand resting near the revolver at his hip. Victor froze, then slowly lowered his hand, though he didn't release Violet. "This doesn't concern you anymore, Alderman. You won her fair and square, had your fun, and now I'm taking back what's mine." "She doesn't belong to either of us," Zane replied evenly. "And if you don't step away from her right now, you'll regret it." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Victor laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You think you're so righteous, the gallant cowboy saving the damsel in distress, but I know men like you. You wanted her for yourself just like all the others. Only difference is you had the money to buy her outright. Step away." Each word was measured, deliberate. Something in Zane's tone must have penetrated Victor's alcohol-fueled bravado, because he finally released Violet, shoving her roughly toward Zane as he did so. "She's not worth the trouble anyway," he spat. "Damaged goods." Zane's eyes never left Victor as Violet moved to stand beside him. "If you ever come near her again, it'll be the last mistake you make. That's not a threat, it's a promise." Victor straightened his vest, attempting to salvage some dignity. "Threats from a man who won't be around long enough to keep them. Your business with the agency wraps up soon, doesn't it? And then you'll ride away, just like all the other drifters." His gaze shifted to Violet. "And she'll be right back where she started." Without waiting for a response, he pushed past them and stumbled out into the street, leaving behind only the lingering smell of cheap whiskey and menace. Zane turned to Violet, his expression shifting from cold anger to concern. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her arms ached where Victor had grabbed her. "I'm fine, just shaken." She drew a steadying breath. "How did you find me?" "I was on my way to meet you at the bookshop," he explained. "Saw him drag you into the alley." His jaw tightened. "I should have put a bullet in him." "No," Violet said quickly. "That would only have made things worse." She hesitated before adding, "He was right about one thing, though. Your business here is temporary. What happens when you leave?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had voiced during their growing friendship. Zane's gaze held hers for a long moment before he offered her his arm. "Let's not talk about that here," he said quietly. "Come on, I'll walk you back to Mrs. Peterson's." They walked in silence, each lost in thought. When they reached the boarding house, Zane paused at the bottom of the steps. "Join me for a ride tomorrow?" he asked. There's something I'd like to show you out past the edge of town. Curious despite her lingering unease, Violet nodded. What time? I'll come by after your morning shift at the bookshop. True to his word, Zane appeared the following afternoon with Rusty and a gentle mare borrowed from the livery. Violet had ridden occasionally as a girl, but it had been years since she'd been on horseback. Zane helped her mount with patient guidance, making sure she was comfortable before they set off. They rode west out of Yankton, following the winding path of the Missouri River. The June day was perfect warm sunshine tempered by a light breeze, wildflowers dotting the prairie grass that stretched to the horizon. After the confines of the saloon, and even the relative freedom of town, the open landscape filled Violet with a sense of possibility that made her heart race. "It's beautiful," she said as they paused to rest the horses on a small rise overlooking the river. Zane nodded, his expression softening as he gazed out at the view. "This is what I wanted to show you." He gestured toward a stretch of land nestled in a gentle curve of the river. "That piece there. 160 acres of good bottomland with access to water year-round." Violet shaded her eyes, taking in the plot he indicated. A small cabin stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees, with what looked like the beginnings of fenced fields beyond it. "Whose land is it?" she asked. "Mine," he replied simply. "Or it will be once the paperwork is finalized next week." She turned to him in surprise. "Yours? I thought you were just passing through." "I was," he admitted, "at first. I've spent years moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots." He paused, searching for words. "But lately I've been thinking it might be time for a change." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're planning to settle here, in Yankton," he nodded. "I've saved enough to make a start. The land's good for raising cattle, maybe some crops too. The cabin needs work, but it's solid." His eyes met hers, hesitant yet hopeful. "What do you think?" The question seemed to ask more than just her opinion on the property. Violet felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "I think it looks perfect," she said softly. "A place to build something lasting." A smile broke across his face, transforming his usually serious expression. "That's what I thought too." He dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. "Would you like a closer look?" They spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the property. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace and windows that caught the western light. Outside, a creek fed into the river, providing fresh water even in the driest months. Wild plum and chokecherry bushes grew nearby, promising fruit for preserves come fall. As the sun began its descent, they sat on the cabin's front step, sharing the simple meal Zane had packed: bread, cheese, and apples. "I could be happy here," Violet said, almost to herself. Zane glanced at her, then looked away quickly. "I hope you will be." She turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" He set down his apple, suddenly looking uncertain, an expression she'd never seen on his face before. "Violet, I didn't bring you out here just to show you my land. I brought you here because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I wanted to ask if you might consider sharing it with me." Her heart stuttered in her chest. "Sharing it, as my wife," he clarified, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "If you wanted to, that is." The world seemed to still around them. Even the birds fell silent, as if waiting for her response. "Zane, she began, struggling to organize her thoughts. "We've only known each other a few weeks." "I know," he acknowledged, "and if you need more time, I understand. But I also know that in those weeks, I've come to care for you more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, held hers. "I admire your strength, your kindness, the way you've embraced your freedom instead of being broken by what came before it." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but I have nothing to offer you. No dowry, no skills except serving drinks and cataloging books. You have yourself, he said simply. That's all I want. A tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. What if Victor was right? What if I am damaged goods? Zane's expression hardened. Don't ever let me hear you repeat his words again. There's nothing damaged about you, Violet Zimmerman. Nothing at all. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed the tear from her face with his thumb. The gentleness of his touch undid her completely. I care for you too, she admitted, her voice barely audible. More than I thought possible after everything, but I'm afraid. Of what? Of trusting this happiness, of believing it can last. She looked down at her hands. Every good thing in my life has been taken away. My mother, my home, my freedom. What if this is taken too? Zane was quiet for a long moment. Then he took her hand in his touch warm and steady. I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen, Violet. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that whatever comes, we would face it together. As equals, as partners. The word equals resonated through her like a bell. No one had ever offered her that before, the chance to stand beside them rather than behind or beneath them. I don't need an answer today, he continued. Take all the time you need. Think about it. Pray on it if that's your way. The offer will stand. As they rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Violet felt as though she'd crossed some invisible threshold. For the first time since she was a child, someone had asked what she wanted rather than telling her what she must do. The enormity of that gift left her speechless. That night, in the quiet of her room at Mrs. Peterson's, Violet tried to imagine what life might be like as Zane Alderman's wife. Not as property or an obligation, but as a partner in building something new. The image came easily, too easily perhaps: mornings, cooking breakfast in the cabin kitchen, afternoons tending a garden, evenings reading by lamplight while Zane mended tack or calculated figures for his cattle business. It was a simple vision, but after years of survival in the harshest circumstances, simple seemed like a miracle. She slept fitfully, dreams mixing memory and possibility in confusing patterns. In the morning, she woke with sunlight streaming through her window and a clarity that had eluded her the night before she could second-guess herself. She dressed quickly and made her way to the hotel where Zane was staying. The clerk at the desk directed her to a small parlor where guests could receive visitors. Zane appeared moments later, his hair still damp from washing, surprise evident in his expression. "Violet, is everything all right?" "Yes," she said, suddenly nervous despite her resolve. "I needed to see you, to give you my answer." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He crossed the room to where she stood, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "And what is your answer?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied, the words surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. "Yes, I will marry you, Zane Alderman." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "You're certain? You don't need more time to consider." "I'm certain," she affirmed. "I want to build that life with you on that land by the river. I want to be your partner, your equal, your wife." He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "You've made me the happiest man in Dakota Territory, Violet Zimmerman." "There's just one condition," she added, summoning her courage. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Name it." "I want to help in the cattle business too, not just with the household. My father taught me figures before he—" She trailed off, then steadied herself. "I'm good with numbers. I could keep the books, help with contracts." Instead of dismissing her suggestion, Zane nodded thoughtfully. "That would be a tremendous help. I've never been as skilled with ledgers as I am with the animals themselves." He squeezed her hands. "Partners in every sense, then." The relief that washed through her was powerful. Even in his acceptance, he'd confirmed what she'd begun to believe, that he truly saw her as an equal, with contributions to make beyond cooking and cleaning. "When?" she asked, suddenly practical. "When should we marry?" "As soon as you're ready," he replied. "The reverend at the Methodist church could perform the ceremony, or we could wait until the circuit judge comes through next month if you prefer something more official." Violet considered this. "The reverend," she decided. "Next week, after your land paperwork is finalized." She hesitated, then added, "I don't want a big affair, just us and perhaps Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Thompson as witnesses." "Whatever you want," Zane agreed. His expression grew serious. "There's one more thing we should discuss." He led her to a small settee where they could sit side by side. Victor Blackwell. The name sent a familiar chill through her. "What about him?" "He's a problem that won't simply go away," Zane said gravely. "Men like him don't forget perceived slights. As long as we remain in Yankton, he'll be a shadow over our lives." "Are you suggesting we leave?" Violet felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of abandoning the beautiful riverside property he'd just acquired. "No," he assured her. "This is our home now. I won't be driven away by a bully." His jaw set in a determined line. "But we need to deal with him directly and permanently." Alarm flickered through her. "Zane, if you're thinking of not violence," he interrupted quickly. "There are other ways to handle men like Blackwell." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "During my time here, I've learned quite a bit about his business dealings. Not all of them would stand up to official scrutiny." "What do you mean?" "The territorial tax assessor arrives next month," Zane explained. "I happen to know that Victor has been operating with two sets of books for years, one that shows his actual profits, and another, much leaner version that he presents to authorities." Violet's eyes widened. "Tax fraud," Zane nodded. "Among other irregularities. I've gathered evidence, testimonies from people he's cheated." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. "Including this." She took it hesitantly. It was her own ledger, the record of her supposed debt that had kept her bound to the Red Garter Saloon for 3 years. "I had an accountant in Sioux City review it," Zane continued. "The numbers don't add up, Violet. Not even close. He was charging you triple the going rate for room and board, adding phantom expenses, manipulating the interest. It wasn't just immoral, it was illegal." A strange mixture of anger and vindication washed through her as she stared at the ledger. All those years, she'd suspected as much, but had no way to prove it, no one to turn to for help. "With this evidence, plus statements from others he's defrauded, we can ensure Victor Blackwell never threatens anyone in Yankton again," Zane concluded. "But I won't proceed without your agreement. This would mean coming forward publicly, testifying perhaps." The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. Standing up against Victor, facing him in an official proceeding, it was terrifying. But so too was the thought of living in fear, of other vulnerable people falling into his trap as she had. What would happen to him? She asked. At minimum, hefty fines and damage to his reputation. At worst for him, the loss of his business license and possibly jail time, depending on how extensive the fraud proves to be. Violet took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her second momentous decision of the day. Let's do it. Not for revenge, but to make sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. Zane's expression was a mixture of pride and concern. It won't be easy. Few worthwhile things are, she replied, surprising herself with her own conviction. They spent the following days making preparations on two fronts for their wedding and for their case against Victor Blackwell. Reverend Hayes agreed to perform the ceremony the following Saturday. Mrs. Peterson insisted on baking a cake, while Mr. Thompson offered his parlor for a small reception afterward. Meanwhile, Zane arranged a meeting with the territorial prosecutor, who would be accompanying the tax assessor on his visit to Yankton. The evidence they'd gathered was compelling, not just Violet's manipulated ledger, but similar accounts from 3 other women who'd worked at the Red Garter under similarly coercive conditions, plus testimony from ranchers and merchants who'd been cheated at Victor's card tables or in business dealings. Word traveled quickly in a town the size of Yankton. By midweek, Victor had caught wind of the impending investigation. He confronted Zane outside the land office, his face mottled with rage. "You think you can destroy me?" he snarled, drawing the attention of passers-by. "You're nothing but an upstart drifter. I've got friends in this town, connections you can't imagine." Zane regarded him calmly. "Your connections are abandoning you as we speak, Blackwell. Nobody wants to be associated with a man about to face criminal charges." Victor's hand twitched toward the gun on his hip, but even in his anger, he was conscious of the witnesses gathering around them. "This isn't over," he growled before storming away. That night, Zane insisted Violet stay at the hotel rather than the boarding house. "Just until the wedding," he explained. "I've arranged a room for you 2 doors down from mine. I don't trust Blackwell not to try something desperate." Though she chafed at the disruption to her hard-won independence, Violet recognized the wisdom in his caution. Victor had never been one to accept defeat gracefully, and now he was cornered, his livelihood and freedom at stake. The night before their wedding, Violet sat by the window of her hotel room, watching the activity on Yankton's Main Street below. Anticipation and anxiety warred within her joy at the life she was about to begin with Zane, fear of the confrontation still to come with Victor. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Zane standing in the hallway, a small package in his hands. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," he said with a sheepish smile, "but I wanted to give you this tonight." Violet invited him in, curious. He handed her the package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What is it?" she asked, carefully untying the knot. "Open it and see." Inside was a book, a beautiful leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poems. She opened the cover to find an inscription, "To Violet, my partner in all things. With love, Zane." "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the gilt-edged pages. "I noticed you reading poetry at Thompson's shop," he explained. "Thought you might like your own collection." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. It wasn't extravagant or showy, but it demonstrated how closely he'd been paying attention, how much he valued what she valued. "Thank you," she said, looking up to meet his gaze. "Not just for this, but for everything. For seeing me when no one else did." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that made her heart beat faster. He stepped closer, one hand gently cupping her cheek. "How could anyone not see you?" he murmured. "You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." The kiss that followed was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as she responded. It was nothing like the forced kisses she'd endured at the saloon. This was an invitation, not a demand. A beginning, not a taking. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zane rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Before I forget every good intention I have about waiting until tomorrow." Violet nodded, though part of her wanted him to stay. "Tomorrow," she agreed, "when we begin our life together properly." He kissed her once more, briefly but with promise, then took his leave. Alone again, Violet hugged the book of poems to her chest, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in just 1 month. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Zane Alderman. The thought no longer frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a quiet certainty that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. The following morning dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself approved of their union. Violet dressed in her best gown, a modest blue dress she'd purchased with her first earnings from the bookshop. Mrs. Peterson arrived to help with her hair, weaving wildflowers into her dark locks. "You make a beautiful bride," the older woman declared, stepping back to admire her work. "And that Alderman fellow is a good man. I've seen how he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." Violet blushed. "I'm very fortunate." "Fortunate, yes, but you deserve every bit of happiness coming your way," Mrs. Peterson insisted, "after what you've been through at that awful saloon." She clucked her tongue disapprovingly. The whole town knew what was happening there, but nobody did anything until your young man came along. The observation stung with its truth. Yankton had been content to look the other way while Victor Blackwell held women in what amounted to indentured servitude. It was a reckoning still to come, one that Violet was increasingly determined to see through, but today was for joy, not justice. She pushed thoughts of Victor aside as Mrs. Peterson escorted her to the small Methodist church, where Zane waited with Reverend Hayes and Mr. Thompson. The ceremony itself was brief, but heartfelt. Violet found herself surprisingly calm as she spoke her vows, her voice clear and certain. Zane's hands were steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another thoughtful gift she hadn't expected. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hayes declared with a broad smile. "Mr. Alderman, you may kiss your bride." Their second kiss was even sweeter than the first, sanctified now by promises made before God and witnesses. When they turned to face the small gathering as husband and wife, Violet felt a surge of happiness so intense it brought tears to her eyes. The celebration at Thompson's bookshop afterward was modest but joyful. Mrs. Peterson's cake proved delicious, and Mr. Thompson surprised them with a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for a special occasion. Several other townspeople stopped by to offer congratulations, including the schoolmistress who confirmed that Violet could begin as her assistant when the new term started in September. As the afternoon waned, Zane leaned close to his new wife. "Ready to see our home?" he murmured. She nodded eagerly. The land paperwork had been finalized just the day before the Riverside property was officially theirs, a wedding present to themselves. They said their goodbyes and thank yous, then headed to the livery where Rusty and the mare, now purchased rather than borrowed, waited to carry them home. The ride out of town was filled with a companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of the future stretching before them. As they crested the final rise that would bring their property into view, Zane suddenly reined in, his expression changing from contentment to concern. "What is it?" Violet asked, following his gaze. Smoke rose from the direction of their cabin, not the thin wisp of a cooking fire, but the thick, dark column of a structure burning. "No," Zane muttered, spurring Rusty forward. "No, no, no." Violet followed, fear clutching at her throat. They covered the remaining distance at a gallop, arriving to find their worst fears confirmed. The cabin was engulfed in flames, the dry wood burning fiercely in the summer heat. Zane leaped from his horse and ran toward the building, but the heat drove him back. There was nothing to be done, no nearby well, no neighbors to form a bucket brigade. All they could do was watch as their future home blackened and collapsed in on itself. "Victor," Violet said, the name like ash in her mouth. This was Victor. Zane's expression hardened, his earlier distress giving way to cold rage. "Yes, this has his mark all over it." They stood in silence as the fire gradually burned itself out, leaving nothing but smoking ruins where their hopes had been. As the sun began to set, Zane finally turned to her, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "I'm so sorry, Violet," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our first day as husband and wife, and he's taken our home from us." She moved to him then, taking his hands in hers. "No," she said firmly. "He's burned a building, nothing more. Our home is wherever we are together." She glanced around at the land that still remained theirs. "We can rebuild, Zane, better than before." His expression softened, wonder replacing anger as he gazed at her. "How do you do that?" "Find strength when anyone else would break." "I learned long ago that breaking doesn't help," she replied simply. "And now I have something worth being strong for." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "We'll go back to town tonight," he decided. "Stay at the hotel while we figure out our next steps." "And tomorrow," Violet added, her voice hardening with resolve, "we finish what we started with Victor Blackwell." The ride back to Yankton was somber, the joy of their wedding day tempered by the destruction of their home. Word of the fire spread quickly through town, along with whispers about its likely cause. By morning, a delegation of townspeople arrived at the hotel, led by the mayor himself. "This has gone too far," Mayor Jenkins declared, his usual political caution giving way to genuine outrage. Blackwell's antics were bad enough when they were confined to his saloon, but arson, that's a crime that threatens the whole town. The tax assessor and prosecutor, who had arrived the previous day, joined the meeting. With the evidence already gathered, plus fresh witness testimonies about Victor's whereabouts during the fire, they had enough to act immediately. "We'll take care of this today," the prosecutor promised. "You have my word." True to his promise, by noon a group of deputized men, led by the town marshal, surrounded the Red Garter Saloon. Victor Blackwell was arrested without resistance, the fight seemingly gone out of him when confronted with the full weight of the law and the community's turned opinion. The search of his office yielded exactly what Zane had predicted: double books showing years of tax evasion, plus ledgers documenting the manipulated debts of several women who had worked for him under coercive conditions. It was enough to ensure he would face serious charges, with the likelihood of several years in prison. As Victor was led away to the small jail to await transfer to the territorial prison, he caught sight of Zane and Violet watching from across the street. His face contorted with hatred. "This isn't over," he called. "You'll never be rid of me. Never." But his threats rang hollow now, stripped of the power that had once made them so terrifying. Violet felt no fear as she watched him being taken away, only a profound relief that justice, so long delayed, had finally arrived. "What now?" she asked Zane as they turned away from the scene. He smiled, the weight of recent events lifting from his shoulders. "Now we rebuild, together." And rebuild they did. The community, perhaps seeking to atone for their years of inaction, rallied around the newlyweds. Lumber was donated, labor volunteered. Within weeks, a new cabin began to take shape on their land, larger and sturdier than the original, with proper windows and a stone foundation. While construction progressed, they stayed in town, Violet continuing her work at the bookshop while Zane finalized contracts for his cattle business. They spent evenings planning their future, dreaming of the life they would build together. By late August, just as Violet was preparing to begin her position at the schoolhouse, their new home was complete enough to move in. The day they rode out to the property as permanent residents was one of quiet celebration. The cabin smelled of fresh cut wood and possibility. That night, as they lay together in their new bed, Zane traced gentle patterns on Violet's bare shoulder in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. She turned to face him, her heart full to bursting with emotions she'd once thought lost to her forever. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" "More than I can say," he replied, drawing her closer. I came to Yankton looking for business opportunities, not expecting to find the other half of my soul. As summer gave way to autumn, their lives settled into a rhythm that brought contentment to them both. Violet divided her time between assisting at the schoolhouse 3 days a week and helping Zane with his growing cattle brokerage. Her skill with numbers proved invaluable as the business expanded, her careful bookkeeping ensuring their operation remained profitable even when markets fluctuated. They planted an orchard beside the cabin apple and plum trees that would bear fruit in years to come. Zane built a chicken coop and brought home a milk cow. Violet started a vegetable garden and learned to preserve its bounty for winter. Each improvement to their property became a testament to their shared vision, a future built on mutual respect and deepening love. News came in October that Victor Blackwell had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for tax evasion, fraud, and arson. The Red Garter Saloon was sold at auction to pay his debts, purchased by a businessman from Sioux City who renamed it and ran it as a respectable establishment where no woman was held against her will. With that chapter of her life definitively closed, Violet found herself able to look forward without the shadow of the past darkening her days. The nightmares that had plagued her for years gradually faded, replaced by peaceful sleep in the safety of Zane's arms. Winter arrived with its usual Dakota ferocity, howling blizzards and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath in the air. But inside their cabin, warmth prevailed. They spent long evenings by the fireplace, Violet reading aloud from her growing collection of books while Zane carved wooden figures with surprising skill. They talked of everything and nothing, learning the contours of each other's minds as thoroughly as they'd learned each other's bodies. In February, as bitter winds whipped snow against their windows, Violet discovered she was carrying their first child. "A baby," Zane whispered when she told him, his voice filled with awe. "Our baby." The wonder in his eyes as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach moved her to tears. This child would know nothing but love and security from its first breath, so different from her own experience, from Zane's too, in his way. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. His answer was to lift her into his arms and spin her around the cabin until they were both laughing breathlessly. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Mrs. Alderman." As spring returned to the prairie, bringing new grass and wildflowers, Violet's body changed to accommodate the new life growing within her. Zane watched these changes with fascination and tenderness, his protectiveness increasing with each passing week. "You're doing too much," he'd protest when he found her working in the garden or helping with the livestock. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she would retort, though she allowed him to take over the heaviest tasks as her pregnancy progressed. Their son, Samuel James Alderman, was born on a perfect September day in 1873, arriving after a labor that tested Violet's endurance but ultimately rewarded her with a healthy, robust boy who had his father's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair. "He's perfect," Zane murmured, holding his son for the first time, his usual composure completely undone by the tiny being in his arms. "Absolutely perfect." Motherhood brought Violet a joy she hadn't known was possible. Each milestone in Samuel's development, his first smile, first laugh, first tentative steps felt like a miracle. Watching Zane as a father only deepened her love for him, his natural tenderness with their son revealing new dimensions to the man she'd married. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings. The cattle business weathered economic downturns but ultimately thrived under their joint management. Violet's work with the school evolved into a position teaching the older children literature and mathematics, allowing her to use her education while still having time for her family. Their land expanded as they were able to purchase adjacent parcels. What had begun as a modest homestead grew into a respectable ranch with a herd of cattle, fields of wheat and corn, and an orchard that produced abundant fruit. The original cabin was expanded twice to accommodate their growing needs. In 1876, their daughter Elizabeth Ann joined the family, followed 2 years later by another son, William Robert. Their home rang with children's laughter and the everyday sounds of a family building a life together. Through it all, the bond between Zane and Violet only strengthened. The partnership they'd promised each other on their wedding day proved resilient through droughts and blizzards, through illnesses and setbacks. They faced each challenge as they had from the beginning together, neither one bearing burdens alone. On their 10th anniversary, with their children tucked safely in bed, Zane presented Violet with a small wooden box he'd carved himself, decorated with intricate patterns of wildflowers. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Open it and see." Inside was a gold locket, oval-shaped and gleaming in the lamplight. When she opened it, she found tiny portraits of their 3 children on one side and a miniature photograph of Zane on the other. "It's beautiful," she breathed, holding it to her heart. "Not as beautiful as the life you've given me," he replied, taking her hand. "10 years ago, I walked into a saloon looking for a drink of water and found the other half of my soul instead." Violet smiled, remembering that fateful night. "And now look at us. 3 children, a thriving ranch, respect in the community." She shook her head in wonder. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's real." "It's real," he assured her, drawing her into his arms. "Every moment of it." As they stood together in the home they'd built, surrounded by evidence of the life they'd created from nothing, Violet thought back to the words Victor Blackwell had once spoken to Zane. "She'll never be free." How wrong he had been. For in choosing to love and be loved, in building a life of purpose and meaning, she had found freedom beyond anything she could have imagined that night in the Red Garter Saloon. Freedom wasn't just the absence of captivity, she'd learned. True freedom was the presence of choice, of dignity, of love freely given and received. It was found in the quiet moments of everyday life, teaching her children to read, working alongside her husband, contributing her talents to their shared dreams. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Violet whispered the thought that had been growing in her heart throughout the day's celebrations. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the locket?" Zane asked, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "For everything," she clarified. "For seeing possibility where others saw only profit, for offering partnership when others demanded submission." She nestled closer in his embrace, for proving him wrong that night and every night since. Zane's arms tightened around her. "I think we proved him wrong together," he murmured against her hair. "And we'll keep proving him wrong for the rest of our days." As the years continued to pass, their prediction proved true. Their children grew into capable, compassionate adults who carried forward the values their parents had instilled. Samuel took over much of the ranching operation. Elizabeth became a teacher like her mother, and William studied law before returning to Yankton to practice. The town itself grew and changed with the times. The railroad came through, bringing new opportunities and connections to distant markets. Dakota Territory eventually achieved statehood, split into North and South. Through it all, the Alderman Ranch remained a constant, a place of welcome, of hard work and abundant love. Victor Blackwell never returned to Yankton after serving his sentence. Rumors placed him in various frontier towns, always one step ahead of trouble, but his power to harm them had dissipated like morning mist under the summer sun. In 1898, as the century drew to a close, Zane and Violet celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children's spouses, and a growing brood of grandchildren. The gathering took place under the apple trees they'd planted in those early days, trees now mature and heavy with fruit, a living testament to patience and faith rewarded. Looking around at the family they'd created, Violet felt a contentment so complete it brought tears to her eyes. From the darkest chapter of her life had come this abundance of joy, not by chance, but through courage, through choice, through love that had proven stronger than chains. "What are you thinking about?" Zane asked quietly, coming to stand beside her as the grandchildren played a rowdy game of tag nearby. "About how a single night can change everything," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. His hair was silver now, his face lined with the evidence of years lived fully, but his eyes remained as clear and true as they had been that first night in the saloon. "About how love is the truest freedom." He smiled, taking her hand in his, the same gesture he'd made thousands of times over their years together, each time a renewal of that first promise. "The best decision I ever made," he said, "was walking into that saloon and asking for a glass of water from the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Violet laughed, the sound as free and joyful as her heart. "And the best decision I ever made was believing you when you said I could be free." As the Dakota sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together watching the future they'd created unfold before them, living proof that even in the harshest circumstances, love could take root and flourish, bringing beauty where once there had been only barren ground. The saloon boss had said she'd never be free. A cowboy had proved him wrong that same night, and in the years that followed, they had built a freedom together that neither could have imagined alone, the freedom to love, to grow, to become their truest selves in the shelter of each other's hearts.